If you were to ask my daughters, they would tell you that there are some drawbacks to being a PK. That is, a preacher's kid. You always have to go to everything at church. And you have to get there early, and you generally have to stay late. And that's a drawback to being a PK. You're not able to do some of the things that other kids are able to do. They say is so much fun, but you can't do that because you're held to a higher standard because you're a PK. I'm quite certain that the complete list could be obtained by speaking to either Rachel or Jamie. They would be more than happy to tell you the rest of the list. But you know, for all of the drawbacks that there are a few perks as well, some advantages. One of those is that you can plant ideas for classes and sermons in your dad's ear, and he's going to listen to you. Especially if it's a special day like today. Because today is Jamie's birthday. So for part of my present to her, I asked her what she wanted me to preach on this morning. Now, I was somewhat reluctant to do that. Because 4 years ago, it didn't quite work out like I had planned. I asked Rachel her birthday was on a Sunday, and so I said, Rachel, what do you want me to preach on Sunday? And she was 12, and she just had that tween attitude and said, I don't care. Okay. I gave her a couple of chances, and each time I got the same answer, I don't care. So I preached a pretty good sermon on apathy that morning. And I might share it with you sometime. I was kind of hoping that I would get the same response from Jamie, and that I could share it with you this morning. But she actually remembered that, and she decided that she had a topic in mind and an idea for me. And strangely enough, last Sunday night in our elders and deacons meeting, a similar idea was brought up, which I think just sort of goes to prove the point of the sermon on God's perfect timing. Have you ever noticed that God's timing and our timing aren't always in sync? They don't always work together. They aren't always, the same time, so to speak. We think the way that it works, or that it's supposed to work, is that we ask and God does. We pray, and God says, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. And boom, it happens. Kind of like a genie. You rub the lamp and the genie pops out. What is your wish, my master? And we say, well, this is what we want. And we kind of think that God is supposed to do that with us. But that's not always how it works, is it? God's timing, when He does say yes, and by the way, we need to understand that He's the master and not us, but that's another subject for another time. But God's timing can sometimes be, a little bit slower than our timing by our standards. In fact, by our standards, sometimes God runs late. Now, I want us to look at a couple of examples of God, quote unquote, running late from the Bible. One of those examples would be Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. In Genesis 18, God comes to Abraham with some good news, some incredible news, some awesome news. Within a year, they were going to have a son, he and Sarah would. Again, this is incredible news. This is something that is worth getting excited about. This is something worth celebrating and all. But there's a little bit of an issue. See, in Genesis 18, Abraham is 99 years old and Sarah is 89 years old. Thing is that created a problem in their minds. See, physiologically, it was impossible for them to have a child. Impossible. It can't happen. Now, 24 years earlier, when God had initially made the promise and everything, that would have been a stretch, okay? But it might still could have happened. But now, 24 years later, when God comes and says, within a year, I'm going to return and Sarah will have a child, a son. Well, Sarah has been listening and eavesdropping a little bit on the conversation, and she burst out laughing. And I'm sure Abraham probably had to bite his tongue not to laugh. I imagine both of them thinking to themselves, God, you're just too late. Then there's Moses in Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses is 80 years old. 80. Not only is he 80 years old, but he's been on the lam for 40 years. For 40 years, he has been living in exile from Egypt because, well, we'll get to that in a second. But for 40 years, he's been wandering around, living in exile, and then he sees a burning bush that's not really burning. I mean, it's really on fire, it's really burning, but it's not burning up. And so Moses goes over to investigate, and God says he wants him to go and lead his people out of slavery. 40 years ago, Moses would have jumped at the chance. 40 years earlier, Moses have been eager to jump to the Israelites' aid. In fact, he had jumped to an Israelites' aid, and that's why he's in exile now, because he had killed an Egyptian. And the Israelites didn't appreciate it. He is understandably hesitant, I think. I mean, sure, he had survived the attempted genocide of the Israelites back when he was born, and Pharaoh had given orders for all the Hebrew baby boys to be thrown into the Nile River and everything. Yeah, he had survived that. Everything was good. Yes, his parents had hidden him and everything, and because they knew that he was no ordinary child, Hebrews 11:23 tells us. So yeah, Moses had the idea that maybe God had something special planned for him and something special in mind for him. But that was 40 years earlier. When I read this account of the burning bush, I can almost hear Moses muttering under his breath, God, you're about 40 years too late. Another example is Esther. Esther chapters 1 through 10. In Esther chapter 1 through 10, God's people were in trouble. They were in trouble. Because of their sinful activity and behavior, they had been exiled to Babylon. And now, the Medes and the Persians had taken over Babylon. Some of them had been moved to Persia. Well, the king had a little problem with his wife and had made some rash decisions concerning her. And Esther had been made queen. Esther was a Jew. But Xerxes didn't know this. But she was queen, and she saw her people suffering. Suffering not just because they were away from their homeland, but suffering because people didn't like them very much. In fact, one person in particular didn't like them. His name was Haman. And this really bad guy named Haman had plotted to destroy the Jews. And not only had he plotted to destroy the Jews, but he had got the king's signature on the order to exterminate the Jews. And Esther knew that meant her too. Plans were already made by Haman for a special treatment for Esther's uncle Mordecai, who was really the cause in Haman's mind of all of this. But you know what? When it seemed like all hope was lost, when it seemed like it was completely, totally, utterly hopeless, Mordecai comes to Esther and says that she has to save her people. And look at what he says to her in Esther 4, verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? When it seemed like God had waited too long to save his people from Haman's plot, God maybe put Esther in that position just so that she could act and so she could save her people and his people. And then one more example from the New Testament, Mary and Martha, John chapter 11. Mary and Martha had a problem. Their brother was sick. Their brother's name was Lazarus. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were friends of Jesus, good friends of Jesus. And so Mary and Martha do exactly what you would expect good friends of Jesus to do. They send for Jesus. Why do they send for Jesus? Because Jesus can heal the sick. Their brother Lazarus is sick, so they send for Jesus so he can come and heal him. Jesus, though, he gets word, and he stays where he is for 2 whole days after he received word. 2 days. Jesus knows what's happened, but the disciples don't. Bottom line, Mary and Martha, their brother was sick, but now their brother was dead. Their brother was dead. Jesus had delayed. He had stayed where he was for 2 whole days longer. And now Lazarus was dead. And Jesus could have healed him. In fact, the Jews, they say, couldn't he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this guy from dying? They're wondering about it. Mary and Martha, you can almost hear the disappointment and desperation in their voice in John 11:21 and John 11:32, where they say to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But now Lazarus has been buried for 4 days. Jesus was 4 days too late. Yes, it would seem that God is frequently late. Yet I'm struck by a rather paradoxical truth. And that is that while God may be frequently late, God is always on time. God is always on time. Let's finish looking at some of the examples that we've already looked at and seen and given. Abraham and Sarah. They laughed. They laughed because God was obviously late for them. They laughed because God had waited 25 years to fulfill a promise that was, even when he originally made it, still seemed to be 25, 30, 40 years too late in the first place. Yet, they continued to laugh. As Abraham bounced his son on his 100-year-old knee. Moses, God's timing, again, 40 years too late. Moses was ready to jump to the Israelites' aid 40 years earlier. Now he doesn't know if he can do it. God's timing was 40 years too late, or was it? How'd that work out for Moses? What about Esther? Esther, when it seemed like all hope was lost, that there was no possible way, no possible escape for God's people, God had put her in just the right spot at just the right time to save her people. And Mary and Martha, They were sure that Jesus was late. They were sure that he could have healed their brother, but now their brother is dead. And they don't know that there's anything that anyone can do about that. But because Jesus did show up and he did come to them, Lazarus was raised from the dead. In each of these stories, and in others like them in the Bible, God is quite obviously late. That's what we see. That's the human perspective. That God is late, that he is not on time, that things could have been better, but now they're worse because God delayed his action. But if we examine our own lives, we notice that the times that God was late, or that we were certain he was late, that we can see that he in reality was actually running right on time. Let's take a look not at the examples already given, but at some of the examples we've already experienced from other scriptures that we know and that we've heard of. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. Isaiah writes these words on behalf of the Lord. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God operates on a different thought level than we do. God has a vantage view, we might say, that you and I don't have, that we are unable to have. Because you see, our view is constrained to the snapshot, we might say, of our current situation. Whereas God has the picture of our entire life in his view. And so a lot of times when we think God's running late, really what's happening is he's delayed, not because he's mean and he's the bully in the sky who has the magnifying glass and we're the ants and everything like that. He's delayed because he knows what's best for us. And he's waiting for us to figure out what's best for us as well. We could also look at Romans 8, verse 28. "And we know that in all things God works together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Whatever happens to us, good or bad, it fits a design. It fits a plan that God has for our lives. God is in control of our lives, and we need only to trust him. See, Romans 8:28 doesn't say that everything is good. It doesn't say everything's going to be easy, that you're never going to have to work hard, that you're never going to have to do anything that kind of sort of calls on you to put forth an extra amount of effort or effort period. What he does say is when you put forth that effort, God's going to take it and make something great out of it. Then a few chapters earlier, in Romans chapter 5, verse 6, we're told the most incredible news about God's perfect timing. It says, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." You see, Jesus came and he died not too early and not too late, but his timing was absolutely perfect. Certainly there have been times in my life where it seemed like God was a little late. Not just a little late, sometimes it seemed like he was way late. For the first few years of our marriage, Monica and I struggled with fertility. Wanted to have a child. My brother, my sister, they had children. Christmas time, we'd go to my parents' house and they had kids and we had a Cocker Spaniel that my mom didn't really like very much. Especially when we said, well, we're going to bring our dog with us. You're what? Okay. But we struggled with that. As we were struggling with that, I was let go from my first ministry job, which was a very rough time, very stressful time for us. I spent 9 months working in human resources at a college district in San Antonio, which human resources is a lot like ministry. You sit all day and listen to people's problems and then tell them there's nothing you can do about it. But after those 9 months or so were over, I received a job offer from the church in Leedy, Oklahoma. A couple days after I accepted that job, found out that Rachel was going to be born. God's timing is always perfect. Always. Even in our journey here to Siloam Springs, there were circumstances that came up and ideas and decisions that were made and things of that nature that boggles our minds. There were circumstances, it seemed like God was too late. But I've always found that God's timing is absolutely, without a question, perfect. The same is true for you if you'll stop and think about it. Just like Abraham, you may laugh because God is calling you to do something that is, in your own mind anyway, quote unquote, physiologically impossible. But what we need to remember is when we feel like that's happening to us and we feel like something is physiologically impossible, we need to remember what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, that all things are possible with God. Just like Moses. You may sense, you may feel that God has a purpose for you. You know He has a special purpose for you, but you've been waiting for 40 years and it hadn't happened, and He's about 40 years too late. But let me tell you something, even in your later years, you can still do all things through Christ who gives you strength, Philippians 4, verse 13. Maybe like Esther, God has put you right where you are, right now, for a reason. You might be confused as to what that reason is. You might not be able to see it. Maybe somebody needs to come in and they say something to you like Mordecai did for Esther to sort of wake her up and say, hey, you're where you are for a purpose, for a reason. And the same is true for this congregation. We are here at this point where we are today for a reason. God has a purpose, has a plan in mind for us as a body. And we need to figure out what it is, and we need to move towards it. We need to keep on pressing toward the goal, for which God has called us heavenward in Christ Jesus, Philippians 3, 13 and 14. Maybe just like Mary and Martha, you feel He maybe could have done something, but He's just a little bit late. You need only to cast all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you, 1 Peter 5, verse 7. And always remember to wait on the Lord. For the promise Isaiah made in Isaiah 40, verse 31 still stands. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. Are you weary? Are you faint? Just wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord and you will find that His timing is always perfect. And something else that you'll find out is that He really, truly does and can make all things beautiful in His time. The trouble is getting to His time. The trouble is waiting on Him. Because sometimes waiting on Him means we have to endure certain things. Perhaps ridicule, perhaps other things and people wonder, well, what's going on with you? Why don't you, like Job? Like his wife says, why are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. And we just say, hey, no, God has a plan, God has a purpose, and I'm going to wait on the Lord. It's hard. Sometimes it's real hard to wait on the Lord. But if we do, we're promised that the reward is something far greater, far better, far and away, above and beyond anything that we can ask or imagine. If something's not right between you and God this morning, you need to make it right. Because while this whole sermon has been about God's timing and waiting on the Lord may not wait on us to make things right. You see, He's given us chance after chance after chance to make things right between us and Him. If you haven't done that, if you haven't been immersed in the watery grave of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, why not? Don't wait, because while God is patient and He's going to have things happen in His time, Jesus could return. And then it'll be too late. If you're subject to the invitation of Jesus and you need to make a public response to have that need met, why don't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together.